Well, welcome to our Podcasters Roundtable. I want to thank all of you for coming. We really appreciate you spending a couple hours with us tonight. We have a lot to discuss, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. What I'll do is have everybody on our panel introduce themselves. I have a short sound clip to play from each member of our panel to further introduce themselves a little bit. I'll start. My name is John Gay. I am a 15-year radio DJ turned podcaster, and I create podcasts for businesses and nonprofits, and occasionally do a podcast myself, and this is the beginning of what my show sounds like.
What's up? It's Andy Grammer with Jag.
Hi, this is Carly Rae Jepsen, and you're listening to Jag.
Hey everybody, it's Joe Jonas hanging with Jag.
This is Heather Knox, Playboy's Miss January 2012. With the hottest Jag I've ever seen.
It's B.O.B. checking in with my homie Jag. So much swag with my homie Jag.
It's the Jag Show Podcast.
And that's the beginning of my show. And I create, like I said, podcasts for businesses and nonprofits here in the area under my Jag in Detroit company. And with that, I'll turn it over to my friend Shannon and let him introduce himself.
Thank you, John. My name is Shannon Kaysen. I've been in podcasting just over 10 years. I've started a number of podcasts. My first podcast is Homemade Stories. It's still going on, where I just tell personal stories. I did another one with WBEZ Chicago. Homemade Stories was with WBEZ as well, but I did another one with WBEZ Chicago called The Trouble with Shannon Kaysen, where I tell stories of people's troubles. Everybody got troubles, you know. And I'm really excited about a new project I'm working on in Detroit. It's called In Good Co Detroit, and I'm telling the stories of Detroit entrepreneurs. It's part of it's part of the New Economy Initiative, and push with the Knight Foundation is putting some things behind it. But I'm able to go out and tell stories of new and old businesses in Detroit and really dive into the business owners. The clip he's about to play is one of the owners. He started, he's been in business for a while, but he has a shop on the Livernois Avenue of Fashion called 313. And I grew up in that area, so I'm kind of bringing in my story in with his story, and you can kind of tell that from the clip. So looking forward to talking to everybody. Welcome to In Good Company, honest stories of the real-world journey to becoming an entrepreneur in Detroit and Southeast Michigan. Because some of us are living it right now. I mean, like right now. But you're not alone. You're in good company. I'm Shannon Kaysen. Traveling north on Livernois Ave, passing the University of Detroit Mercy, just before 7 Mile, the businesses on both sides of the road become less sparse and stand closer together until there's a continuing chain of business after business, store after store, beauty salon, restaurant, shoe repair, cleaners, coffee shop, art gallery, and various clothing stores. It's known as the Avenue of Fashion, but keep traveling, pass Outer Drive. On the west side of the road, there's a sleek silver and black building with pane glass windows and a cool glass garage door. And across the face of the building in tall letters are the words spelled out, no numbers, 313, Detroit's brand name. Talking with Fame, his presence is star quality, and it goes along with his alter ego nickname, F-A-M-E, for fashion, art, music, and entertainment. As I ask about how he got here to this historic Detroit Avenue of Fashion location, I'm intrigued that Fame's story actually starts in Buffalo.
I was actually born in Buffalo, New York. My family moved here to Detroit when I was 7 years old. And before we moved, I can remember us visiting from time to time. Mm-hmm. And typically would be in the summertime during the African American Festival. I can really, really remember just coming up under the viaduct on the lodge there, seeing those lights. Lights underneath the viaduct was a big deal, coming from Buffalo. And then we would pull out onto Jefferson, and the streets would be packed. They would just be full and bustling with people and music and the smells of the food. And it was just like, to me, that's my first impression of Detroit.
And that is Shannon Kaysen. who I met at Podcast Movement last year because I saw a guy had an Old English D on his hat, and I thought we needed to start a conversation. Robin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Robin Kinney, and I'm a bit different from everyone else up here is that I don't have my own podcast right now, shocker. I actually own a podcast production studio in Southfield with a second location opening up in Midtown this spring, and have been producing podcasts for the last 6 years. So I'm really passionate about podcasting. I'm excited to be up here, and I'm excited to be here with not only other people who are interested in podcasting, who know a lot about podcasting, but with people like yourselves who want to learn more about podcasting, because it's certainly a genre that is going to continue to increase. And the more voices that we have in this podcast space, the better. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me, John.
And this is Robin's promo clip from Motor City Woman.
At Motor City Woman Radio, we know the only way to guarantee representation in the media is to create it yourself. Motor City Woman places women in the forefront, not only on issues that affect women, but all issues. That's why we are changing the face of broadcasting, because we believe that every woman has a story, a belief, an opinion that matters.
And I didn't even say the name of the studio. That's Motor City Woman Studios. So our impetus was about increasing the number of women in broadcasting, and then that spilled over into podcasting.
And I'll say this about Robin. We worked together on a project last year and had a client that presented a few challenges here and there when it came to timing and issues. And Robin and her husband Mike could not have been more accommodating and incredible to work with. So I really did enjoy working with you last year. Becky?
Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm just honored to be here. Honestly, I'm learning from all these folks because I'm probably the newbie of the crew. So I've been into podcasting for about 2 years. I host an arts and entertainment podcast all about the good things happening in Detroit and the amazing people that are doing them, called The Debrief. And we also started a podcast production company, myself and my partner Seth Ressler. It's called Michigan Podcast Production, specifically focused on arts and entertainment organizations as well as businesses looking to do branded podcasts, which I think we'll all touch on later. I'm also a tour guide in the city, so I work for Feet on the Street Tours. I manage the company, and I kind of look at that as live podcasting when I give my tours. So I would say overall I'm a Detroit ambassador, and I just think I love this city so much and the people in it. So I love being a storyteller. And I think podcasting has just been an incredible medium for me, which, like I said, I really didn't know much about till about 2 years ago. So I find it exciting, and the fact that everybody's wanting to get involved and you can sort of create your own path is super cool. So that's me. Thanks for being here.
And here is Becky's promo from The Debrief. And I met Becky co-hosting with her on The Debrief, and she's one of my favorite people and knows everybody in the entire city of Detroit.
Now that's a lie.
Hey there, my name is Seth Ressler.
Hi everyone, it's Becky Scarcello.
I am new to the Detroit area.
And I've been here my whole life.
So we started a podcast together. It's called The Debrief.
Detroit's arts and entertainment podcast.
We cover concerts, comedy, plays, food, drink, all kinds of stuff.
All the cool events around town, things to do, and the people that are doing them.
Can we talk about some of the people we've had as guests on this podcast?
Hey, this is Mark Kurlianchik, the restaurant critic for the Detroit Free Press.
Hi, I'm Ian DeLisi, and I host Essential Music on 101.9 WDET.
Hi, this is Mark Ridley of Mark Ridley's Comedy Castle.
Hey, this is Kate Williams, executive chef of Lady of the House.
Hey, this is Meltdown from WRIF in Detroit.
This is Josh Mallerman, author of Bird Box.
This is Carmen Harlan, curator of film at the Detroit Institute of Arts.
President and founder of Valentine Distilling Company.
The general manager of innovation experiences for the Henry Ford.
Arts and entertainment editor at the Detroit Free Press.
The Michigan Science Center.
Arts Beats and
Detroit Public Theater. The Detroit Shakespeare in Detroit.
If you like going out in the city of Detroit, you're going to like this podcast.
The Debrief Podcast.
We like to say Detroit's moving.
Keep up.
The Debrief.
Your guide to Detroit's arts and entertainment scene.
We have had some pretty cool guests, so that was nice. Yeah.
I love these radio people who do these incredible takes, and then you're going to hear mine that I put together. So I'm Joe Salsihai. I have a personal finance show called Stacking Benjamins. I just moved back to Detroit a year ago. January 1st of last year, packed up my cat, my spouse, and I, and drove 900 miles back to Detroit. And riding 900 miles with a cat sounds like a Shannon Cason story in the making right there. I've been podcasting for 8 years, and I've been listening to podcasts almost since the beginning, and I would always talk about my favorite shows. Oh, I love this show. Oh, you listen to this podcast? And my friends kept telling me, they'd say, you got to have a podcast. You got to do a podcast. But in personal finance, Dave Ramsey and Susie Orman were talking, and I didn't want to yell at people about their money. I didn't want to be the expert from on high. And then one day, I'm mowing my lawn, and I'm listening to these guys on NPR, Click and Clack, who have Car Talk. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Car Talk. But the cool thing about Car Talk is you can listen to that show and you won't learn about a car. You will learn nothing, but you'll have a great time learning nothing and just laughing your head off. And all of a sudden I go, oh my God, I have an idea. Nobody's doing this in finance. Let's create a show that's designed to teach you absolutely nothing about money, but you have such a great time that you just might learn something. So we created Stacking Benjamins 8 years ago, and it's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Joe. Now we have to mark this as explicit.
What if there were a podcast that owned the fact that, come on, most podcasters, they're really in their mom's basement? And what if there were a podcast that were about a serious topic? Money, for one, but it didn't take itself or the topic so seriously. I know. How great would that be? Welcome to the Stacking Benjamin Show.
Live from Joe's mom's basement, it's the Stacking Benjamin Show.
So here's how it works down here in the basement. Doug kicks things off with his open, and then OG and I talk about some headlines ripped from the current financial press.
Hello, darlings. And now it's time for your favorite part of the show, our Stacking Benjamin's headlines.
We talk to interesting guests. And on our way down to the basement, it's Gabby Dunn. How are you? For a return trip to the basement. So glad we have her. Jill Schlesinger's here. How are you?
I am so great, and I feel very honored since when did we speak about the end of the year? We were doing year end?
3 weeks ago. So
this is unbelievable. I want to come on every 3 weeks.
You should come on you would save the show. We need somebody. So if you like your money talk, less preachy, less jargon, or you're just starting out and you want to jump into the money pool, what a great place. Join us at Stacking Benjamins every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, wherever you listen to podcasts.
That's good, man.
And I'll say something nice about Joe, because I'm saying something nice about everybody up here. I will say, so Podcast Movement is the world's largest podcast convention, and this past summer it was in Orlando, and I went to a panel that Joe led where he talked about how the first 2 minutes of a podcast are key. And if somebody tunes in to your podcast for the first time and they hear, here's what I had for lunch today, and then here's how to follow me on social media, before you've given them any content of value, they're going to be gone. And so the analogy that Joe made was it's like a James Bond movie that starts with a car chase or a helicopter chase or something like that. Grab people's attention right off the bat. And if any of you came to my podcast presentation in September, I did give you credit, but I did steal that from you, and I used that in my presentation because I thought it was so good. So thank you for that.
Thank you, man. Yeah, that's good advice. I'm Zach Rosen. I started making audio stories in 2006 as an intern at Detroit Public Radio. Right after college, and making audio is the only thing I've ever done for money as a grown-up, which I'm so lucky about. I'm now the podcast guy at Graham Media. Graham Media owns WDIV and a bunch of other TV stations around the country, and everyone, they are trying to get into the podcast space, so they brought me in to try to work with their reporters and producers and think about their strengths and ways in which TV can make podcasts. So I've worked on a bunch of different shows. I produced some shows. I edit some shows. I've hosted shows in the past, but the clip that I'm going to play now is from my most recent project, which is a 6-part kind of documentary podcast about Jimmy Hoffa. And we found his body, and I'm going to tell you where it is. But you have to stick around till the end of the event.
That is a fantastic tease, Zach.
And this is a clip from, I think, the second episode. The host is Steve Garagiola, the lineman guy who you've been seeing on the 11 o'clock news for the last 30 years.
La Cosa Nostra. That's Italian for our thing, or this thing of ours. It's how members of the Italian mafia sometimes refer to themselves. The roots of La Cosa Nostra stretch back to 19th century Sicily. Its members began immigrating to the United States and Canada over 100 years ago. And yes, La Cosa Nostra still exists today.
Nowhere near the force that they were in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But they exist in the shadows. They thrive in the background like they always have.
Journalist Scott Bernstein.
They're very immersed in white-collar society. They own a lot of legitimate businesses. They still control most of the illegal gambling. They still extort and shake down people in their community, mostly Italian business owners and whatnot. They have a role in wholesale narcotics trafficking.
Bernstein says the Detroit Mafia families still active today are some of the same families Jimmy Hoffa worked with throughout his career and who may have had something to do with his disappearance. Families like the Tocos, Zarellis, and the Giacalonis. You can trace their involvement in the mob back to pre-Prohibition era Detroit. Now, I'm about to give you a lot of names, and you're not going to remember all of them. But I want you to appreciate the long path carved from today back to the roots of organized crime in Detroit.
If you're a Toco or Zarelli or Giacalone, I apologize.
And I will say, Zach, I think Channel 4 is really ahead of the curve in terms of what TV stations are doing with podcasting. I think you guys are doing a great job over there. I think you guys really were making a name for yourselves in the space before, not to talk bad of any of it, before the other TV stations in the market. I think you guys have done a really good job with that. So as you can hear from our panel, there are so many different ways to tell a story, and there are so many different ways to use audio to get your point across and to paint a picture. You don't use the same parts of your brain when you're watching something as when you're listening to something, because when you're listening, your brain has to paint the picture, as opposed to when you're sitting in front of a TV or a computer or a tablet, you just have the picture right in front of you and you veg out. That's what's amazing about storytelling and about audio, and you saw it with examples of every clip that you just heard from our entire panel. So I've got a couple general things that I'm going to throw out to the panel, and anybody can kind of jump on these, and we'll start an open discussion here. Let me start with asking about the creative process, and who can briefly take us through their creative process of how it goes from brain to Apple Podcasts, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I'll kick it off. I'm actually working with a client right now, and the process that we started with just a 1-hour consultation. So in that consultation, we talked about not only the outline, but I always ask people who want to go into podcasting, what do you want the listener to feel while listening to your podcast? What do you want them to do after listening to your podcast? Because that's really going to lay the foundation for what you talk about, who you talk to, what language you use. You know, is it more relaxed? Is it instructional? Is it educational? So I'm a big energy person. So it's like, what do you want to give out so that if a person is just walking and you're in their earbuds, do you want them to get motivated? Do you want them to laugh? Do you want them to think? You know, so I always start at where do you want the listener to feel? And, you know, once you get that foundation down, that's really going to set the tone for everything else.
I can piggyback off of that. So with our show, we spend a lot of time thinking about who's our audience. And like you said, what do you want them to do? So I can talk all day long about the cool things going on in Detroit, but I want to get people excited to actually go. So I want to talk about restaurants in a way that they're going to want to go have a meal there. And they're going to want to go see a local band that they've never heard of before, just because I'm describing their music. So, but we also know that that's only realistic to a point. So then we thought there's also an audience that maybe is not going to go do all these things, but they like to be in the know. And Detroit's trendy, and what's going on is trendy, so that's okay too, conveying that. But and I think show prep to get to this point is so super duper important. So I didn't really realize that going in. I'm like, hey, I got cool stuff to say. I just hop on the mic and start saying it, and everybody's going to want to hear it. But that is so not true. And I think the art of podcasting is making it sound natural and fun, but that you have literally planned it all out. Like, you know what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, what you're going to talk about. Like, I do go out a lot, and I am in Detroit a lot, but I also check 250 websites every single week to see like what's hitting, what's not, what's going on. It takes time, but it's not random what I'm talking about. So I would say, like, if you're thinking of starting a podcast, it's important to be passionate about what you're talking about, so much so that you want to do that kind of research and you want to get at the best stuff and you want to do the prep work to convey what you want your audience, what the action or the feeling is, and there is a lot that goes into the background of it.
One of my early mentors in radio taught me that doing a radio show or now even a podcast is like driving a race car, and I know nothing about NASCAR, but a NASCAR driver does everything he can. Everything before the race in the pit is when he does all the work, and when the race starts, all you've got to do is drive the car. And if you want to do a podcast because you like the sound of your own voice and you want to do it as a vanity project, you can. Nobody's going to listen. You're not going to probably sell any ads on it. But if you have something that you want to say and you have a real passion for something, the prep will really come out. And I like what Becky said about how it sounds like it's off the cuff and not rehearsed, but the work that goes in beforehand, the more you put in, the more you'll get out.
I love the idea of congruency too, that your audience is going to get the right mood from the way that you talk. I thought that was great. I think a lot about the fabric of our show, being a show that comes out 3 days a week. I want the structure to be the same, but I want people to be surprised and delighted every time they turn it on. So I want to make sure Monday doesn't sound like Wednesday and Wednesday doesn't sound like Friday. So I'm worried about diversity. And when I talk about diversity, I mean every type of diversity. I want people that are different ages, from different backgrounds, telling different stories about different things. And I also, more than I was in the beginning, it's funny because I wasn't kidding earlier when I said I want to be Shannon. It's, being a finance podcast, I feel like there are a lot of us that are trying to get across important points. And I found that when I had that attitude, nobody really cared about the points. But when we started telling stories about people that had things in their way and here's how they removed those obstacles, the storytelling for us was huge for our podcast. So when people pitch us to be on the show, or when we go look for people, which we start about 5 weeks beforehand because we want to make sure that everything is different than before and the fabric is good, I'm looking for these stories that I haven't heard before.
I agree with what you said. Outline is so important. If is it podcasters in the room? I don't know. Some podcasters here, raise your hand high like you like being a podcaster. Okay, so outline, and you probably do that. If you don't, it's nothing wrong with it. People say I do stage stuff and I'll do stories on stage, and they'd be like, "Oh man, you just sound like you just came up and just came out the top of your head." Not at all. I practiced it and I put it all together. But outlining is so important. I talk to so many people about podcasts. Even if you don't write every word, just knowing where you're going next is going to save you so much time. Because even if you edit your podcast, it's if you don't know where you're going, you're gonna have all this tape, and having too much tape is hell on earth. You know, you get what I'm saying?
Editing
it's hell.
sucks.
You're doing a 15-minute podcast with 3 hours of tape. You know, it's just, you're like, oh, my life sucks. You know, so outline is so important, and everybody covered that.
Yeah, I guess I'll just talk a little bit about narrative podcasts because it's what I mostly work on, and I think talking about how you get from the beginning to the end with Hoffa, for instance, I was just noticing that all the talk about Hoffa was about what happened to his body and why he got killed and how. And I'm not like a true crime guy. I'm not particularly interested in that stuff. And so I was just thinking, well, how did he get to be someone who became the focus of, why does America care so much about this guy that disappeared? Why are we so fascinated with Hoffa? And I went in not knowing what a Teamster was, not really knowing anything about Hoffa. So I was really interested in kind of inverting the story where we don't even get to the disappearance until the last episode, and I was just interested in learning about American labor through and American organized crime through his life. So we kind of just told the story chronologically, and narrative chronology is your friend. So it was kind of simple. We started at the beginning when he was this 18-year-old warehouse worker with a bone to pick with his boss, and we were kind of off and running from there.
You just outlined 6 episodes?
Yeah, we made an outline like Shannon said. Yeah. We thought maybe it would be 8, but we compressed it a bit because coming from public radio, I always learn cut, and that may or may not be the right impulse. But I'm just so afraid of wasting people's time because there's only 24 hours in the day, and we got a lot of stuff to do, and I want to get in and get out and tell a clean, tight story.
Do you begin with I want interviews here, and here, or do the interviews come and then you put them?
So yeah, we had. With Hoffa, it was chronology. So who can speak to Depression era Detroit? Who can speak to Hoffa's early life? Who can talk about what a Teamster is? So we kind of plug the interview subjects into the questions we're trying to answer with each episode.
I love that. I think that is the way you put it all together like that is great. I want to move on to other questions. Kind of been as we discussed this amongst the group. One question that kept coming up as we were planning this out is ways you grow your audience, and how do you grow your audience? I'm curious for what tips and tricks and tools that each of you has used to grow your audience.
Well, I'll start that out. I started podcasting the end of 2009, so it was 2010 is when I kind of got started.
Podcaster.
Yeah, and it'd be, I don't even know how 30 people found it, but it'd be about 30 people who would listen. Now, creating it, in my mind, I'm like, I want to create something because I think that I'm great. My mama patted me on the back when I was young. So I'm like, I'm great. So I wanted to make something when you go back 10 years from now, this is going to be wonderful. And I would come with that mindset. I think that's important because when you start, you're not going to get many listens. So you have to feel like your first episode that you're proud of it because that's going to be still, as much as you grow, people are going to go to your first episode and go back and listen to it because that's just what we do, And from that 30, I was so happy when I got to 100, And what I noticed, the biggest moves were when I went on other shows. So I started working with The Moth. I started telling stories with The Moth, which is an NPR podcast, and I would tell stories with them. I was telling stories with them. They were putting them on their radio show podcast, and I never mentioned my podcast. I never say, hey, mention Homemade Stories. I do a podcast. I just felt like that was wrong to do or something, but at some point somebody said, hey man, you do a good podcast, mention it. So Snap Judgment was running one of my stories, and I remember I was sitting next to Glenn Washington, and I was like, hey man, can you mention Homemade Stories? He was like, yeah, I didn't know you had a podcast. I'm like, yeah, just mention it. He mentioned it. The next month, I had 20,000 listeners.
Wow.
20,000 downloads.
From 100? From 100 the month before?
From that month. Yeah, they played it.
It was 100.
They played it on it was, I think, 2013. They played it as their year-long, I told a good story, and it was like, this is our best story of the year or whatever. And he has a podcast called Homemade Stories, and then the next month, 20,000 new listeners was on my podcast. Now, he did something, because you'll find from podcasters and radio shows and all that, they need content. They got to, This American Life, they got to come out every week or whatever. They hurting on content. Right now, somebody's scrambling around trying to figure out what the story is going to be. So for Snap Judgment, I did a real good episode, and they were like, hey, Shannon, we're going to use this whole episode as our podcast. And I'm like, okay, I ain't got a problem with it. Y'all going to pay me for it? Okay, and I get, So they did that, and they put it up as a podcast. Shannon Casons presents Homemade Stories on Snap. In the next month, it was 100,000 new listeners because they played the whole episode. So the one thing is, it's just, I've found growing my audience has been in joining the audiences of bigger podcasts or just other podcasts in general. They don't even have to be bigger, because if you go on other podcasts, stand out. Like, want to stand out. If I'm on stage, I want you to be like, who is that guy? Or who is that? Even in the panel right now, I want somebody to come up and say, hey, I really like the things you were saying. So want to stand out when you go on the podcast, and then people are going to listen. They'll connect to a piece of you and say, I want to see what that Homemade Stories, that In Good Company is talking about. So that's what I found where I've got the biggest, do your flyers and your all that kind of stuff, but going on other shows because it's a podcast listener listening.
I want to emphasize the first thing Shannon said, though, because I remember the glee. I'm reminded of it a lot. We have a frequent contributor to our show who sends me this whenever I get down. She's been on our show since the beginning. Paula sends me this email from maybe week number 4 of our show. And I am delighted, and I can still read the delight in my words about how we went from 66 listeners to 69 listeners. And I'm ecstatic. And still, by the way, I think of 69, 70 people in this room. Like, that's a big number of people that are listening to me, right? That's cool. And now we have, 35,000 listeners a show, and I don't even know what that number means. I have no idea. But 70, I know that number. So I want to echo that part, and maybe in more of a Gordon Ramsay kind of way, make a great show. Like, the way to grow your show is to make a great show that you're proud of and that people want to share with their friends. My goal is to make a finance show like a Netflix show that I binge. I get done with the Netflix show and I go, oh God, I got to watch the next one. I want to try to take a finance show and make it bingeable. I haven't figured it out yet, but that's my goal. I also want to echo something that I'm a big fan of a guy named Roman Mars, who has a great podcast called 99% Invisible. You want to make a show you love, but you're also looking for continuous improvement. Roman said this, and I'll just echo it. I am embarrassed of the shows that I made a year ago, and my goal is to be embarrassed about the shows I'm making today a year from now. You should be. Yeah.
And just like a tactical thing, getting on people's show, it's easier said than done. I mean, that story Shannon told on Snap Judgment is a killer. That's the one from when you worked at the bank, right?
It's very good.
Yeah, that's like the best story ever. And we all don't have Shannon's lived experience, but
we don't all go steal money and go to...
You can't give it away. Don't give it away.
Go back and listen to the podcast.
But the idea is you can reach out to podcasts that have a similar audience to you and that are similar in size. So if you're making a show about classical music that has 50 listeners, you reach out to the flute soloist guy who also has a show, and you say, I will promote your show for 30 seconds at the beginning of my next episode if you do the same for me. So it's this free organic trade, and you don't need to pay, and it's kind of like you're not trying to get on This American Life, you're trying to get on this other small show, and you build slowly like that. So it's reaching out to like-minded and like audience podcasts and just like, hey, let's help each other out.
Well, there's stats behind that too, that people who listen to they don't listen to one podcast. If they're into podcasting, they're going to listen to 10 a week. So, and most people find out about their next podcast by their current podcast. So we do promo swaps too. And I would just add, I agree with all these. The other thing that's been tremendously successful for us is when the guests we have on the show share the episode that they were on. And usually they've had a lot of fun with us and they want to share it, but you make it super easy for them. So
here's the link. Go throw it up on your... Send them the link
right away. We give them an embed code, which is very easy that they can embed on their website. We had Josh Mallerman on like a few weeks after, Netflix, the Bird Box movie went nuts. So I was like, please, Josh. And, he's got these tremendous amount of followers. And it was a really good interview. And it was because he got to talk about some different things. He's an incredible band called The High Strung. I'm like, I want to hear equal amounts about your music. So he was happy to share because it was something different. He's been in tremendous amounts of publications, but he was motivated to share it. And then the downloads for his episode were like we had never seen before. So if you can get other people on your team, so to speak, in whatever format that looks like, that's huge because you can have your little audience and put out content all the time. I was happy when our Instagram got to 1,000. I was like, oh, wow, But if people that have, 12,000 Instagram followers share my stuff, then so.
I'm gonna jump in, and I'm sorry, Robin. I just want to say this real quick: is that coming from a radio background, there is a finite number of pieces in the pie. So when I worked at Channel 955, if they weren't listening to me, they were listening to 98.7. And then when I worked at 98.7, if they weren't listening to me, they were listening to 955. So it was a zero-sum game. You take them from one and go to another. But with podcasting, first of all, it's an incredibly cooperative space. I've got love for everybody on this panel. And one podcast will lead to another podcast, will lead to another podcast. And that's what I love about the space is how cooperative it is. I'm sorry, Robin, go ahead.
Well, I was coming from a different angle. So my background is in the nonprofit sector. I've worked most of my career in various nonprofits across the city of Detroit and primarily helping businesses along different business corridors in the city of Detroit. So I'm all about community and finding that community. Although I agree with everything that was said, you have to start somewhere. So I think when you have a niche podcast, you got to know your stuff, but then you have to find the people who will be interested in learning and listening to that stuff. And so now we have so many different groups and, you have social media, but don't overlook coming out to events like these, going to different community gatherings. Everyone is so active in Metro Detroit. So you can find a local meetup, for example, on the topic that your podcast is about. So don't overlook those types of things when you're building an audience. And I would say to build that community before you launch the podcast. So you're out and about, you're seen as the person who's always talking about art, who's always talking about music. And then now, hopefully you've been gathering some email addresses. You send out an email, hey, I'm launching a podcast, would love for you guys to listen in. And so you've built that relationship, so then when that podcast drop, boom, at least you have that initial amount of listeners, and then you can start doing all of the other suggestions that were presented.
I think that's a really good point, the human connection too. I'm super shameless. Like I go to a ton of concerts and I just have a pocket full of cards, and if I start chatting with somebody and they like live music like I do, it's like here you but yeah, it's and even if that is one listener, like that's cool because they actually met them and they want to engage. So I think that's a really good point, that don't lose that human connection because audio is so intimate. And
what did we do when I was the first person to put my little stickers down there? I was like, I'll put my stickers because there's a bunch of podcast listeners. I'm gonna put my stickers down, and you said,
I was like, oh, well, here's
my stickers too, because that's just how your mind thinks. You're like, okay, I'm gonna stick that right there. And I get people, they'll say, hey, I was in such and such bar, and I saw your sticker, and I'm like,
that's cool, yeah.
I stick it everywhere. If it's meant to stick stuff.
I was using the restroom.
I won't stick it in the restroom. Stephanie, I'm not gonna get you.
Zach, I want to ask you, because you have the built-in megaphone of a television station, how you've navigated those waters in growing the shows.
It kind of works. It only kind of works.
Okay.
Like you'd think, okay, Channel 4, has, I don't know, tens of thousands of people watching the nightly news every night. So if we tell them to subscribe to the podcast, it's going to directly translate. It's not true. People that watch the 11 o'clock news don't necessarily listen to podcasts. There's a sliver in the Venn diagram, but it's not the same folks. About 15% of the listeners of the Shattered, which is the umbrella show that the Hoffa season went into, only 15% come from Michigan. And so I think the TV station was confident in that, all right, we have this megaphone. All we have to do is tell people about it. But I mean, people in this room, or at least your parents or your aunt, asking them if they listen to a podcast, they're like, no, I haven't watched it. How do I buy the DVD? It's like, it's still, the discovery thing is still so challenging. So, we've ran spots on the air, this is how you go into your phone, you hit this button, you hit subscribe. Even with that, it's marginally successful.
Well, isn't it now only a third of the population has listened to podcasts? Still, yeah.
51% of Americans over the age of 12 have listened to at least one podcast, and 70% at least have some familiarity with the term. So we've crossed the 50% threshold, but there's certainly a long way to go.
But I think you make a good point, Zach. You said 15% of your listeners to your podcast. 15% are from Michigan, and it's a Michigan show. Yeah. That really stuck out to me right there, because a lot of people listen to Homemade Stories. They listening to come back to Detroit, or they hear about Detroit or something, and they want to feel Detroit. So I wrote that down because even as I promote a new podcast in Good Code Detroit, a lot of people may be from outside of Detroit. It may be a thing where visitors listen to it a lot more, to feel the city and to get an idea of the scene. So, that makes a good point, because you do a Detroit show. You're working for a Detroit news station, and it's a national look at. If you're doing Hoffa and those things, but at the same time, not looking at it as just. Debrief may be that. Debrief may be people who
it's
outside
local,
of Detroit.
But we have pitched it to hotels, and some have added it on. Some of the hotels have added it on their website. So if somebody's coming for the weekend, our show is super topical and super timely. So we talk about what's going on this weekend. But it is there, and some hotels are like, yeah, I can just point somebody to that's coming in for the weekend, and here's a few things to do. So
that's a great idea for a hotel.
Yeah, there's lots of ideas that, and you never know what's going to stick. And
that's true.
What have been the biggest challenges either facing you personally in your podcasting work, or that you think is facing podcasting in general?
Because I hear this every day, all day. I have so many. Right now, we've produced maybe around 50 podcasts over the years, and it's not about the content. It's not about what equipment to purchase. It's about, the getting discovered, having people find me. And that's the number one issue that I hear a lot is, gosh, I have this great podcast, but I have these 10 consistent downloads. How do I, get over that hump? And I think there's a lot of platforms that recognize that. And so they're putting all these different systems into place that will suggest a podcast, for example. So if you're listening to one podcast, it'll suggest a podcast that maybe is lesser known, but similar content. And so I think that's really going to help people who are just getting into it or have been doing it for a while, but just haven't had that break to reach a larger audience. But another aspect is, don't assume that you need to have a large audience to be successful. Mm-hmm. So being upfront and intentional with what your goal is important. Am I trying to translate this into a TV show one day? Am I trying to brand this to sell a product or service? Or do I just want to be a personality and I just want to make some connections around the world and we're going to have conversations on Twitter? So being upfront with what is the end goal? What do you want to accomplish in the podcast before you dive in? But right now, the number one question that we get is, just reaching a larger audience and making sure that people can find me, because it can be overwhelming when you say, find us on your favorite or wherever, what's the tagline? Find us wherever you listen to podcasts. That's so broad, And so it's like, okay, so how do I get all these people who I think would be great listeners to actually find me and listen, and not necessarily people who know me or related to me?
I thought you made it it doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter, but it's being intentional. I was talking to somebody at Podcast Movement. They had a small podcast audience, but he worked in financial management or wealth management, and he told me his podcast made him $500,000. Wow. But he didn't have many. He didn't have a huge audience,
it was a niche.
But he had the right audience, which he was bringing over clients from something else. So thinking of it in that sense, I know it may be people in niche careers or careers that can use podcasting to grow their credibility, their authority, and all those things. So that's something to think of as well.
The big issue, we're trying to reach a wide national audience, and the big issue that I see isn't that there's so many, it's that the companies on the top are putting more and more and more resources and money into theirs to make them they're making these very expensive shows and putting big money behind them and trying to compete for somebody's ear when they're doing that makes it more difficult for an indie podcaster. So, and then I look at some statistics we saw at Podcast Movement, which is a great conference, by the way. If you haven't gone to that, I love learning at Podcast Movement. I also go to a conference called Podfest, which is a lot of indie podcasters, and I do a lot of networking, kind of solving these same problems we're talking about now. But what frustrates me is seeing that the new podcast listeners, according to stats we saw at Podcast Movement, are coming from Spotify. Spotify is not owning the space. More people are coming from iTunes still and Apple, but the biggest gains by far from Spotify. And Spotify wants the space. And the only thing negative about that is that what the statistics show is that people that listen on Spotify are listening to podcasts because they're following a personality or they're following the big brand. So the indie podcaster, to get to that person. My problem is I don't have Gimlet's money to make a show or NPR's money to make a show of that depth, and I'm not Joe Rogan, right? So because I don't have his built-in audience, I have to try to navigate that, which means marketing, this idea of finding your audience, becomes more important every day.
I'm going to bring the wireless microphone over there because we are recording this for a podcast.
Hi, a big microphone. Now, how do you make money doing a podcast? I mean, that's the basic for, I think, a lot of people here. And stack, how do we stack our Benjamins?
I click my heels together 3 times. No plate, no.
I think one of the best ways is it's a part, your podcast is part of a larger marketing strategy of some sort, especially when we talk of branded podcasting, but the whole field. In and of itself, it's very hard to make money off your podcast. So number 1, do it because you love it. But number 2, do it because it fits into something bigger. Like for me, for instance, I have a tour company. I have a podcast. They talk about a lot of the same things. When I have a tour group of 50 people from the suburbs, I can tell them about my podcast, and they might listen, learn things. And then on the podcast, I advertise my tours. If you're an author or you want to write a book, it often the best way is to have it work with something else. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges coming up. Even the ads now that you can get, that's going to change. And they want to know, advertisers want to know how many downloads you have in order to say if they want to buy ad space. So, and I think that model, some of you I'm sure can speak better to the statistics than me, but that model's going to change too. So.
What kind of advertisers?
Personally, for the debrief, we've chosen not to have any because we cover everything in Detroit and we don't want to appear biased. We are critics and recommenders, so I don't want to have certain restaurants or local companies be swaying. I want to be seen as an independent source. So we've chosen it. Our debrief is often our lead generator for Michigan Podcast Productions. So that's why we started that company, because so many people that came in were wanting to do their own podcast and asking for advice, we're like, well, why don't we turn this into a company? And then it works like that. So
how much do you charge for?
Well, we can talk off the mic, but no, it really, I can't, it's not an easy answer because as you've probably already picked up, there's so many different kinds of shows. Like ours is heavily produced with many segments and pieces to it and field interviews and things like that. A real popular type of podcast is a one-on-one interview podcast. That's the cheapest. But if you're like This American Life, that's a high production value, or the Hoffa podcast, you're getting into much more. So it's not an easy, but there's definitely a menu, and there's all, you can go to Robin's place and what you want to do and just rent her studio time. Or she can consult you on some things. You can come to us and we can tell you everything from show concept to host consulting to the marketing plan. So there's all different pieces to it.
Our show is all advertiser supported. We have 3 advertisers per show. It's difficult disguising those and making them entertaining enough that it's not friction. So we spend a lot of time on that. We try to make them funny, and we also try to make them relevant. I'll give you an example. Last year, this time, there was a new James Connolly book out called Murder Book. And so I would try to pick a fight with my co-host, and then I'd say, I think OG wants to murder me. Oh, by the way, this show's brought to you by Murder Book. And then we go, just these horrible transitions. So we work on that, but it is the worst way to do it. It is, Becky's exactly right. I was told that, by the way, originally. Being paid based on the number of listeners is the worst way to do it. But my thought process was, if I can learn to do it the worst way and everything else falls apart and I get good at this, then I can always fall back on it. And it's just always worked for us that my main goal is to grow our audience. And if we grow our audience, I get paid more. So.
2 quick follow-up points on that is, what Becky said about branded podcasts. With my company, I do something similar that they do with Michigan Podcast Productions. And I'm asking a company to spend money with me to create their show. And they're asking about ROI and how much money I'm going to make off this. But it's really a piece of their marketing that, in turn with social media and newsletters and whatever else they're doing for their marketing, it all really ties together. And I also tell people that, you may not have 1 million downloads. You may not have the numbers of some of these amazing people up here as far as downloads, but you have a dedicated audience. I would rather have 10 podcast listeners than 1,000 likes on Instagram, because those 10 podcast listeners are engaged with your content and you have their attention. And again, I'm drawing my radio background here. When it comes to commercials and advertising, these live reads, and like Joe was just saying, if you make it part of the show and make it part of the personalities. For example, I listen to Pod Save America. Anybody here listen to Pod Save America? It's a political show. And the guys joke around in their commercial copy. They make fun of ZipRecruiter. So ZipRecruiter is their title sponsor. And they had a running joke for like a month where one of the lines in the ZipRecruiter copy they had to read was, ZipRecruiter has a full suite of tools. And they laughed at the line, suite of tools, every time. Yeah, I'm a tool, you're a tool. And they went back and forth about it, but it was their brand, it was their personalities, and it became part of the show. And as a listener, it made me less likely to skip over it. And if you have a small podcast, and I'll use the basket weaving example, if you have a podcast about basket weaving, you might have 20 listeners, but I'll bet you there's a basket company out there that really wants to talk to those 20 people who are really into basket weaving.
Yeah, it's salesmanship in the money side. I 6 years I've had Lagunitas Brewing Company as my sponsor. I don't have huge amounts of numbers, but I do the same thing. People don't skip my ass because I have fun with them. I talk about
I've heard them
drinking and falling off the stool with my in Lagunitas beer. Get the no, just play. But it's that. Is putting yourself out there to talk to, if you're a basket weaving podcast, talk to a basket company. But then I came at it with a career mindset as well with podcasting and thinking about the things of consulting. So I've worked with Spotify on some podcasts. It's a podcast called Mogul I worked with. And I know Zach does a lot of that as well. I've done some with Uninterrupted, which is a sports-related company. So just having the the mindset that is more than just the sponsor. And if you learn things through podcasting, for me, it's storytelling as well. I can pass those things on and create a career from it. Even what I'm doing with New Economy Initiative is something that they've listened to the podcast. So I've had expertise in the podcast field, so I'm able to take that to other opportunities. So thinking of it in that sense, sometimes you can make money and you can make a career out of it rather than just the numbers, the exact numbers. But if you get numbers, you can make money. But it's not really that much. Even I mean, you got to make a lot of money. You got to make a lot of numbers to get real good money.
I wouldn't go
so
into,
you got to look at it from other perspectives.
I wouldn't go into it for the big podcasting money.
No, not at all. No.
Get all that money.
It opens other doors, leads to other opportunities.
I will say this though:
podcasting, I think, is going to be $1 billion in revenue in 2020. But a lot of that, like you said, is the big boys.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Joe, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, too, sometimes, sponsors usually in a show are friction that you're trying to get around and get rid of. So you make it fun so your sponsor stays and your listener stays. And but sometimes the right sponsor can help you. Early on, I'm at this conference, this financial conference, and I'm walking around and I see Fidelity Investments. And if you're know anything about finance, Fidelity Investments is a huge name. We're nobody. My show's maybe 12 months old. And I walked by and I just said, oh, what the hell? And I walked over there and I said to the guy, I'm like, hey, I get this podcast called Stacking Benjamins. The guy goes, oh, tell me more. And he's just kind of bored and using me because he's been staying at the booth all day. And so I tell him a little bit about it, and he goes, oh, that sounds interesting. And I said, well, yeah, you guys, you're serious about money. I'm a former financial planner. My partner's a working CFP. We kind of talk the same language Fidelity does. I tried to build as much bridge as possible. And then I said, so, I thought maybe you'd want to sponsor the show. And the guy looked at me and goes, how much money are you looking for?
Wow.
And at that moment, by the way, I had, you got the devil on your shoulder and the angel on the other one. One side says, this is Fidelity Investments, cha-ching. The other side said, I'm a little tiny show. What can I get out of this? So I said to him, I go, well, we at that time we were once a week instead of 3 times a week. And I said, $100 a month. And the guy, and he goes, $100 a month. And I go, yeah. He goes, well, I got that money for bloggers. Yeah. So he signs up for 4 months. But I tell you, the payoff is I'm a little tiny show with almost nobody listening. And for 4 months, I got to say, Stacking Benjamins is brought to you by Fidelity Investments.
Wow.
Bam. Yeah. And it was, and we start getting all these emails. You guys are big time. You guys must be huge because Fidelity loves you. No, it's because I charged them nothing. So
your listeners don't know how many downloads
they had no idea that it was, both of them loved it.
I agree with boldness to ask. Just ask, ask what you can get to know.
It's about relationships.
Same with guests, I would say. You just ask, yeah. You'd be surprised. I mean, people are excited about podcasting.
I'll just make a quick point. It's not another popular way to make money is direct listener support. So advertising is one way. Another way is to ask your listeners if they believe in you. I give Shannon my money every month. You should, if you're interested in the direct listener support model, obviously pay attention to how public radio does it. They invented it. But there's this amazing essay by Kevin Kelly, who started Wired Magazine. It's called 1,000 True Fans. And he kind of talks about how you don't need 1 million people. If you can get 1,000 people who care about you and will just buy whatever you are offering, whether it's a t-shirt or a podcast or whatever, you can make $60,000 a year with 1,000 true fans. Making a true fan is very difficult, but it's a lot less overwhelming to think about courting 1,000 people than 1 million people. So direct listener support.
I like that approach. I like that approach a lot because you're focusing on your current listener and how do I give them more value? And I think that's ultimately how you grow your show the best anyway, is if I give them so much value that they talk about me all the time and they're a huge fan. So that's what I loved when I read that. That's a great article.
Great. Yeah.
We only got a few minutes left. I want to make sure we leave enough time for audience questions. Anybody else in the audience have a question? We got a couple other topics we can go to. And come on to the back here.
Just asking a question about the value. That's more of my realm. You want to secure the value with your listeners and your fans. So Patreon, you guys have any idea of dealing with Patreon with any direct listeners? You guys have any info on that?
Yeah, I run a show that's on Patreon. First of all, you should have a show, because what a voice.
Yeah.
Great voice.
That's good.
Fantastic. I have a show. I have a show on Patreon hosted by these two amazing sisters. They're activists and science fiction writers. It's called How to Survive the End of the World. And we have about 10,000 listeners per episode. We don't have any ads, but we have about, I think, between 300 and 400 monthly patrons. So people that really just will listen to whatever these sisters say. And that's a pretty good conversion rate. I don't know what percentage that is, but and so it's great. But it's really about getting buy-in from your listeners. But if you get $5, 400 people giving you $5 a month, it's like $25,000 a year or something. So it's viable if you have people that really care about you. So if you have an audience from some other realm of your life going into your podcast, if you're an author or a CEO or a celebrity, like that's a pretty viable way to do it.
He wants to tell you the name of his podcast.
Bring it. Bliss Street. And you're the host? All right, I'm in.
There you go.
You do Patreon?
No, I don't. I'm just starting on Anchor.
What's been great about Anchor is it's really opened the door and accessibility. It's made it a lot easier for a lot more people to do it. And you can record it on Anchor for next to nothing or nothing on your phone. But you can also buy a microphone for $50, a really good microphone for $50. You can spend $400 on a microphone if you want, but you can get a great sounding microphone to plug into your computer for $50.
Just a pointer for everybody here. Anchor is free.
Anchor is free to use on your phone. Yep, I want to make sure we hear that on the recording of our podcast of this episode. Any other audience questions before we wrap up?
Is there a magic frequency number? How often you need to publish?
I don't know that it's so much that, but consistency
Yes.
is really key and huge. You want people to know what to rely on. So whether you're once a week, once a month, keep churning out the content. Now that being said, you can also do a season, a pilot season, say, and record 8 episodes and then put them out. So there's different ways to do it, but you don't want to be like, here's my first podcast I'm super excited about, and then like 3 months later, that you just don't build any momentum. So we're moving to an almost daily show, 20 minutes a day, because that fits our format. But others, I think once a week is great if you can. But I think really you don't have to think about it like, oh my gosh, I'm the Jimmy Fallon show and I got to be on like every night or people won't tune in. You don't have to think about it that way, but some level of consistency and expectation.
There's a term called pod fading in the podcast industry, and what pod fading is a lot of shows after generally about 7 or 8 episodes, and I'm sure, Robin, you've seen some of your clients too, like it becomes another thing on the to-do list, and people tend to lose their passion for it. So when I work with a business or a nonprofit to create a podcast, I sign them up for 1 season. That season might be 3 episodes, it might be 10 episodes, it might be 15 episodes. And we say, okay, we're going to do a finite amount of episodes. We're going to map this out, and again, all the planning and plan what's going to be in each episode. And we get to the end of season 1. If it's great and you want to keep doing it, fantastic, we'll keep going. But I don't want a potential client to think about it in terms of, every Tuesday I got to go pick up the kids from soccer practice, and then I got to go home and I got to record the podcast, because the quality is going to suffer. So think about it as like a trial run. And again, Anchor is a great way to sort of dip your feet into it if you don't want to commit any money to it because you're not sure how long you're going to do it. And then go from there and see if it was something that you felt you connected with and have a passion for, want to do more of. And if not, no harm, no foul.
Yeah, and learn a lot without that week-to-week obligation. You can learn from that first season and change things.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think the reason that there are more aspiring podcasters than podcasters who actually podcast is because sometimes you can get caught up in the rules. There are no rules. You set the frequency. You set what equipment. You set whether you're indoors or outdoors. You can be on a bus. You can be, in a Winnebago. You can be wherever. And I think that's what stalls a lot of people is, okay, I need to do all of my research on the right microphone and the right mixer. Okay, wait a minute, what is a mixer? Let me look. And then months go by and you're like, I'm not sure if I want to do this anymore. Then you circle back 6 months later. But in true podcasting fashion, what I love about podcasting is that I call it the great equalizer. And it's something that anyone who has a passion about anything can share their voice with the world, truly. So don't let what everyone else is doing stop you, because you can, create we're going to be on, every day for 5 minutes. We're going to be on once a week for an hour and a half. Who cares? Just whatever you want to talk about for however long you want to talk about. If you know your audience and you know that they're going to be engaged and you have the content to support that level of engagement, go for it.
The one thing I regret, to your point, is the year I procrastinated and didn't do it. I thought the idea wasn't perfect, that you just get started. And we started slow. My favorite podcast comes out once a month. And I'm so excited. It is not often. It's called Betty in the Sky with a Suitcase. She's a flight attendant. Her name's not really Betty. She carries around a little recording device and talks to other flight attendants about the strange crap that happens on planes.
Oh my God, I have to hear that.
Yeah, I know. I went okay.
It's so awesome. And it's like spinning a roulette wheel. Some they're not that great, and other ones, the jackpot.
But it's enough to keep you coming back.
Every time I'm like, is this one the jackpot? Because the stories are so bad. What's that? It's called Betty in the Sky with a Suitcase.
I will say though, pay. Oh, perfect.
We have a flight attendant in the audience. All right.
Perfect.
Are you Betty?
Are you?
She's Betty tonight.
Oh my gosh, the real Betty. I will say though, pay some good level of attention to sound quality though, because yes, definitely get started, go do it, but at least try to get that, because if it sounds bad or you're always recording in a coffee shop and it's all blah, blah, blah and clinking and people, you can't.
If you think back to when YouTube first came out,
Yeah.
oh my God, there's videos on the internet. This is crazy. I can watch anything. And now, if the video quality is bad, are you going to keep watching it? No.
You abandon it quickly.
And you can, in the two things that will make me tune out of a podcast the fastest: one, bad audio, and two, not telling what you're going to do at the beginning. Hey, so here's my social. So he found this great new place at breakfast. So what you have for breakfast today? And so on, drives me absolutely bonkers.
Yeah.
And
Introduce yourself.
and talk
Say
and tell me what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Tell me what you're going to do, and then do it. We only have a couple minutes left. Any closing thoughts for either predictions for 2020 or just general podcasting thoughts from our panel? Now I'm putting you guys on the spot.
Predictions for 2020. Well, gosh, I'm also a contributor for the Podcast Business Journal, and we just did I think they called it the
Crystal Ball series.
Crystal Ball
Yep.
series, and they asked me this same question: what are my predictions for 2020? And I think I was typing that out during my holiday vacation. So I'm going to think of what I think now the prediction for 2020 is. I don't even remember what I wrote, but I think in general, you're going to start to see more people who are not only interested in podcasting, but people who are listening to podcasting. One trend that I saw kind of go up and kind of come down. Initially, when we thought of podcasting, people were listening to them while doing something else or en route. They're commuting, they're driving, and now we're seeing that people are listening to podcasts at home. I listen to the majority of my podcasts in my kitchen, Alexa, play, blah, 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 blah. And so you're starting to see more of that. And so I'm really interested in seeing how the way we listen to podcasts, how that has changed and how that's going to change like user activity. Because now we're kind of stationary. We're not necessarily moving somewhere.
Any other closing thoughts in general on podcasting or thoughts for 2020 as we get into the new year?
Make your thing.
Yeah,
There's no reason not to it. Even if it sucks, make it, and then the next episode will be better than the previous one. So if you're wavering, just do it. It's fun. It's really fun.
And I think podcasting is such a creative process in and of itself, and then can expose so many others. So I would, like you really turned me on to the podcasts that are about creative process. So even if you're not a visual artist or a musician, I would encourage you seeking out some of those, because podcasting is a lot more creative than I actually knew going in. So that whole process of just like idea formation to conception is really cool. So look up some of those.
On that note, one of my favorite books, this guy's name is Austin Kleon, has a great book called Steal Like an Artist. What I love is learning people from like all these guys. I love like even listening to Zach's podcast clip just at the start of this. He's in a completely different field than I am, but just the way you layer the music underneath and then it went away when you made the big point. Like I'm a finance podcaster. I want to incorporate that in our show, so don't just try to learn from people in your field, learn from people in related fields, because it really makes it more fun. And I think you bring more to your audience that way.
And your point, Robin, the Bluetooth, like I had an earpods. I listen to more podcasts because I got that, because it's just easy to listen to. But then it depends on what you do. Like I like writing. So you can test ideas in podcasting, like if you're a screenwriter or if you're a short story writer or those things. I test a lot of ideas in podcasting, and I've had a few stories optioned just through the podcast. And you'll find that a lot now too. It'll be movies that may have started in podcasts. It'll be TV shows. I think Apple TV has a podcast. I mean, a TV show now on the Apple Plus thing. That's a podcast. I haven't watched it yet, but she's a podcaster. But Olivia Davis or Spencer or whatever her name is, I don't know, one of them people. She was in The Help. But the thing is, you may use podcasting to branch into other things, which YouTube has done as well.
A trend, yeah. Like Homecoming, that show was originally a podcast. I think that's becoming a bigger trend, right? Like
lore,
the stories, yeah. Yeah, becoming content in other ways.
Detroit is hot. Detroit is buzzworthy. So is podcasting. And if you are a podcaster in Detroit, you've got cred already, because these are two things that people are talking about a lot. And so that's a start. And the hardest part about starting a podcast is what they call AFDI, which is actually bleeping doing it. And so AFDI, if you're thinking about doing it, actually do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I want to welcome Stephanie up here for a couple of announcements, and thank you all so much. These are an incredible group of podcasters here in Detroit and Metro Detroit. I can't thank them all enough for taking time out of their busy schedules to come, and it's such a cooperative space. I'm sure that I speak for all of us when I say, please, if you're interested or have questions, get cards, talk to us afterwards, because we are all so passionate about this space, and we could talk about it for another 4 hours. So, Stephanie?
Well, thank you, John, for moderating tonight. I appreciate that. And thank you all also. Zach is actually one of our podcast coaches here at the Detroit Writing Room. So if you want to sign up with Zach for one-on-one feedback on a show you're working on or want to bounce ideas off of him, just a little plug for you. But thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm Stephanie. I'm the founder of the Detroit Writing Room. And this is our first speaker series. So we are now launching this for 2020. Each month we'll feature a different topic, different panelists. Next month, come on back, February 11th, we have children's book authors and illustrators. Devin Skillian of Local 4 News is going to be moderating that. Fun fact, he has written 19 children's books. Anyone know that? Because I did not know that when I reached out to him. And then in March, we're going to have Women in Wine. So women winemakers, business owners, sommeliers, they're obviously going to be bringing their wine for you to taste. And we're looking at some Metro Detroit influencers for April. So we have a whole lot of events here at the Detroit Writing Room, writing workshops, book talks. We've got open mic night on Monday. Saturday, we've got a coffee tasting. So we do a little bit of everything. And we're also a workspace if you need a quiet, distraction-free space to work, or perhaps record a podcast. We do have a conference room. So thank you guys for coming out tonight. Thank you again to the panelists. Feel free to stick around, enjoy some remaining wine, and meet these lovely people. So thank you.
Thank you.